Right, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed today by Beneath the Veil. You may be aware, Oliver, that in the rural area that is the Upper Marshwood Vale, the issue of agricultural ties on buildings has been quite an ongoing matter of debate and application, and one was recently lifted at a bungalow in Marshwood. What's your view of the future of agricultural ties in our area?
Well, it's a very vexed issue, this, because for as long as people are prevented from building ordinary housing in open country, anybody who can get the advantage of building a new home for themselves in open country has a huge comparative advantage with the rest of society. And of course the idea of allowing people who are working on the land to live right by, for example, livestock that need to be looked after was originally brought in order to make sure that farmers who might not be able to afford to buy somewhere a long way away and have some fast means of transport, even if they get fined a fast means of transport, would be able to carry on their livelihoods. So it wasn't originally intended to be an agricultural tie. It was originally intended to be a tie of the farmer or the farm labourer to that farm. And that was the whole reason for allowing agricultural dwellings to be put up when you're in a place where no other dwellings would be allowed. And of course, if you then move, as society did move, to a position where that was widened, so that anybody who was working on the land somewhere, or somewhere in the area, could occupy it, you then got to the position where this was regarded as a way of building a home that might later actually be able to be sold on to people who were not part of that farm. And that's really quite a difficult and complicated thing, because if you then remove all these ties all of a sudden, it's a sort of uncovenanted bonus for the people that happen to be there. But also, of course, it removes the stock of dwellings that are available at a reduced price for agricultural workers. They're not any longer tied to the working necessarily on that farm, but because it's tied to agricultural work, it does mean that agricultural workers can afford to buy a house somewhere in the rural area, which they might not otherwise be able to afford to do at all. But of course, there aren't terribly many agricultural workers now. Indeed. And so you get this very vexed situation where there really aren't many people who want a home that has an agricultural tie and who are entitled to it. And the person living in it, who's trying to sell it, then finds that they have a very restricted market. Indeed, it may get a very low price for it. So this is an insoluble problem. I don't think that just sort of saying overnight we're going to remove all agricultural ties is a sensible policy at all, because if you did that, you would find that people who are working on farms locally who can't afford to get a home of a normal kind wouldn't be able to. And there would be an uncovenanted bonus for all those who were currently in those homes.
Yes, indeed. I understand those issues, and of course it's a result of the massive shift in farming practice,
yeah,
and the huge changes in the world economy and all those types of things that we have seen. Nevertheless, to say that it's an absolutely insoluble problem seems to be somewhat hopeless as a response and fairly defeatist in an attitude.
Well, I think it's insoluble in the sense that you can't have the best of both worlds. You can either have a situation in which we do preserve off-market housing for agricultural workers, in which case you are going to have some people who have difficulty selling their home at a high price, or you don't. But you can't have it both ways. You can't get to a position where we have off-market homes for agricultural workers that are cheaper for them to buy, but anybody who owns one can get full market price for it. This is not doable. You can't fantasize about that world, or you can fantasize about it, but you can't bring it about because they're the opposite of one another. That's what I mean when I say it's an insoluble problem.
What about the concept in some way of keeping the homes tied but widening the type of person who can live there? Because some of the problems we've seen locally have arisen because the tie itself is so restrictive.
Well, it's not actually very restrictive. It's restricted to people who are working on the land. I don't really think it makes much sense to start widening it. If you start widening it, why not include everybody, in which case it's not widened, it's abolished. I think essentially you have to make, it's a binary choice, you have to make the choice either to have off-market housing for agricultural workers, as we do for social rented tenants, for example, as we do for people that qualify for affordable homes that aren't social rented, part ownership and so on, as we do for sheltered housing. You know, there are various categories of housing which we ensure, despite the generally high price of housing, are cheaper for particular classes of people that we think need the help. We either have to decide that agricultural workers are such a class, in which case we need to keep agricultural ties, or that they're not, in which case you need to abolish them. I think still, although I agree with you, there's been a huge change in the pattern of employment, it's worth keeping them.
Right, so keeping the ones we have, and what would your attitude be towards new ones, new dwellings? Do you think that actually we're in a situation in our area, because we're interested here in the Upper Marsh and Vale, are we in a situation where we could reasonably say we don't need more new buildings that are only built because they qualify under an agricultural tie?
I mean, in general, you can't get a new building built on a farm as opposed to a conversion unless the person is actually required by the economics of the farm to be there. There's quite an elaborate process that has to be gone through with a sort of study by one of the university departments to establish whether the economics do require that. I think that's a sort of reasonable arrangement. Even then, I get quite a lot of complaints from people who feel that there's some riding of the system going on by others who feel that it'd be nice to have a house somewhere and therefore establish something which may not be a very serious commercial enterprise and thereby get permission to do something which you or I would never get permission to do. So this is quite a tricky balance. Again, I don't think there is a perfect solution, since you either are going to allow that, in which case you'll get a bit more investment in new farming, but you will also have some cases where people seem to be getting away with murder, or you don't allow it. I think, again, on balance, but only just, I would keep the present system and allow it to happen, because I think it's so important that young people should be able to get onto a new farm. There's not much of it going on, serious new farming, and I think it's pretty important to be able to encourage it.
So just to summarise and see if I've got the right version of what you're saying here, you're saying that agricultural ties aren't really working, but they're the best of a bad lot.
I think that's about right. They're a highly imperfect system for doing something very worthwhile in principle, which is to keep agriculture going in a rural area, even when the returns from it and the wages earned by workers in it are low.
I'd like to move on now to another issue, it's a very local issue, and I know that you're aware of it, which is children going to Marshwood School. There's a long-standing problem with the traffic and the fact that it's very difficult, in fact impossible for many of them to walk to school. A long debate's been going on about this. What can you do to help with that situation, if anything?
Well, many of us have been trying to apply pressure for a long while to make sure that at least there continues to be some kind of transport up and down that road. And the road is not, despite the speed limits and efforts to enforce it and so on, a reasonable place to ask young children to walk along. Or anyway, the part of the road that is effectively outside the curtilage of the main built-up area is not a sensible place for children to walk. and not at all easy for young mums, typically, sometimes fathers with, sometimes a pushchair and a child, for example. I mean, this is a pretty difficult thing. There is an obvious solution, which is what happened in Solway Ash after about 15 years of campaigning about it and many, many meetings. We did eventually get a footpath, which I participated in the opening of a little while ago. And that is the obvious way forward. I mean, it's good for people to walk. It's good for people to be able to walk to a village school. I mean, that's part of the point of a village school. It's a place you can get to from the village by walking. I know many of the parents come from, and children from other nearby hamlets and villages and so on. But for those who are in Marshwood, it'd be very nice to be able to walk. But in order to make that a practical proposition, you need a footpath. Now, the problem about these footpaths is that you or I might think that a footpath requires simply to get a tiny strip of land which one might be able to persuade the owners to release at some low price and create a sort of muddy path of some kind. Not a bit of it. There are all sorts of health and safety regulations and so on that come into play when a council builds a footpath. And it turns out when you allow for all of those things that this sort of motorway footpath that gets built is a jolly expensive item. So it's likely to take a very long while before anybody actually agrees to spend that kind of money on a footpath in Marshwood. And while they're not, then I think the only practical alternative is to have public transport that can get you back and forth.
So it comes down to the financial question of the funding.
Yes, sure. As many of these things do.
Do you think, talking about the financial funding of things, that the erosion of public services has gone far enough?
I don't think that the public services have actually eroded. They've, on the whole, improved. Some of the pressures on them have increased even faster than the improvements in the public service. So, for example, the NHS, or the NHS and social care system, which are probably the most important public service we have, literally matters of life and death, has hugely expanded and hugely improved, and an enormous amount of additional money is being spent on it every single year. The problem is that the pressures on it are increasing even faster because there are more and more frail elderly people as we all live longer and longer. And my own view is that as well as integrating health and social care much more than we have so far to avoid ludicrous conflicts between the two systems which land up with disastrous results for patients. We are actually going to have to grit our teeth as a nation and pay some more tax in order to increase the funding year by year. And Frank Field and I have put forward a cross-party motion in the House of Commons arguing that we should set up a sort of national fund with a hypothecated tax, so you know what your tax money is going to, or your national insurance money, however one arranges it, which just gradually increases year by year to match the growth in the frail elderly population. And you set up some kind of independent body like the Bank of England does for monetary policy or the Climate Change Committee does for carbon to assess what the needs are and then take this out of politics so that everybody can see that there is a set of experts working out what is necessary to keep pace with the increasing pressures. And that sort of arrangement, I think, probably we will eventually have to agree to as a nation. I hope we might get there sooner rather than later.
Okay, I would like to just bring this back down to very local issues, because we could be here all afternoon debating the NHS and the national position and so forth. But of course in West Dorset itself we have a position now where, because of the impending local government reorganisation and the funding pressures as well, West Dorset District Council is struggling in many of its departments. Anybody who's tried to get anything through planning recently would be confronted with
I think that's quite
enormous
wrong.
queues and lack of staffing.
You're quite wrong about the causes of that. Local government reorganisation is not a pressure, it's a release of a pressure. Unless we manage to get local government reorganisation, we will not create the reduced administrative overheads that will permit the frontline services to be better. So local government reorganisation is not a problem, it's an opportunity, a huge opportunity. I hope it will get through. The problems in the local searches and the planning department are not, I think, unlike the problems of the health service, to do with money. They're to do with organisation. And I mean, for example, in the searches, it turned out on inspection after, I mean, I was agitating about this for quite a long while, because people had a very, very long time waiting for searches when they were moving home. And it turned out that we were operating a sort of 16th century system in which there were literally filing cabinets with literally paper files on them. And if you wanted to find out what liabilities and problems and so on attached to a particular house you were trying to buy, and you asked the local authority to conduct a search, it was in the literal sense a search. That's to say, Fred, whoever Fred might be, would be going around from filing cabinet to filing cabinet trying to find out all the bits of paper that related to this house, which were not, there was no sort of digitization or linking of these things at all. There were no computers, there was literally filing cabinets. And the odd state of affairs, of course, is that when you operate on a system like that, if the person who's doing it is the same person who's been doing it for the last 50 years, well, they'll know a lot about it. But if just one or two people leave and some newcomers arrive, it's a nightmare. But we don't have to rely on this anymore, because we're not in that age anymore. We have things called computers. They've been around some while, actually, and they're incredibly good at, they're bad at some things, but they're incredibly good at indexing. That's really what computers do best in the whole wide world. They're brilliant at linking up lots of data points that all relate to one thing. And now, at last, that is being digitized. And when it is digitized, we will have a turnaround of, 24, 48 hours on searches, not the vast times that there were. And incidentally, both for the staff inside the organisation and for the solicitors who are trying to help people buy and sell houses, it'll be a great relief. You don't need any extra money for that, you just need some time to get the digitisation done. It will then actually save money.
Okay. I don't think, or it's my impression, that digitisation will help the listed buildings department, where the problem is possibly low numbers of staff and conservation officers.
Actually, I think that there are organisational problems there too. I don't think, you're right, I don't think that's a digitisation issue. I think that's not having the organisation in a particularly ship-shaped form problem. And I think one of the things that will happen, I hope, as local government reorganisation occurs, is that is not only is an opportunity to reduce the overheads and by squishing together the sort of back office top management of the various councils, but also it's an opportunity to ensure that everybody looks again at the systems they're operating and uses the best one available of the whole mix. And I'm pretty sure that there's no reason on earth why this should be more difficult in West Dorset than it is in many other areas which are spending the same amount of money on it. Again, it's not a money problem, it's an organisation problem.
Okay. So what do you hope that a unitary council for Dorset overall will bring? What will it give us? What will the benefits be? Well,
I think the right way to look at this is what will happen if we don't get a unitary. If we don't get a unitary, the pressure on the adult social services budget is just going to become, I think, intolerable. As I was saying, I'm very much in favour of a national increase in the amount that is available for those things, and there has been some considerable moves of that kind in the past few years. For example, now there's an additional precept for the adult social services, which is welcome. But the truth is that we have more and more frail elderly people in Dorset. I mean, what is happening nationally is happening here, and in the rural areas is happening even more than in most parts of the country. And that just puts a huge pressure on the county council's budget. The only way any of us can see of meeting that within a level of local tax that people will tolerate is if you reduce the costs of the overhead. At the moment, you've got, even after the bringing together of 3 district councils in our case and 2 in another and so on, you've still got several different chief executives, several different set of directors, several different sets of headquarters of people supporting all of that. You've got different sets of people running different functions in the back office, the computing and the pay systems and so on and so forth. Put all that together, you can save an enormous amount of money, as for example our fire service has by putting itself together with the fire service in Wiltshire, and that has released funds for the frontline firefighting, and that's exactly what needs to happen in the case of the unitary, and those funds will then need to be spent on adult social services where there is a deficiency.
I think I read somewhere, and you would know whether it's accurate or not, that West Dorset has the highest level of elderly people in the UK.
I don't know whether it's accurate. It's extremely vexed debate, but I don't think it's in any way important in the sense what is perfectly clear is we have an enormously large number of, because it actually, of course, it's not elderly people, it's not your age which determines the pressure that's put on the social service, it's the question of whether you're frail. And nobody has a very good measure of how many frail elderly people there are, is the truth. But of course we do have a very high proportion of elderly people, and if you have a very high proportion of elderly people, and you have anything like the normal proportion of frailty amongst elderly people, you will have a large number of frail elderly people. So we do have a huge pressure.
Okay, so we've got all these older people in the area. What could you say, what could you do for younger people? What can the Conservative do? What can the Conservatives do for young people in Dorset, and in this part of Dorset?
Well, I don't think governments are good things for doing things for people of any kind. The duty of the government is to keep the various services operating and to provide a framework of the whole country which allows everybody, but in particular young people as they emerge into adulthood, to have opportunities of every kind. And they get those by living in a country that's well organised and whose economy is flourishing. So you can't do things for people, I mean, well, you can, but it's a very silly thing to try to do things for people in a particular area from Whitehall. This is not a good plan.
I think we might possibly be living in a different country from each other on that. Okay. Leaving aside policies and politics, what's your vision for West Dorset and how could that be brought about?
Well, I don't think it's a question of how it can be brought about. I think it's a question of how it can be preserved, in the sense that I think if the rest of the country were as lucky as West Dorset is in many respects, we would be living in a better country than we are. We have an incredibly low rate of unemployment. We have a hospital which is in very good order in Dorchester. We have schools that are good. We have a very beautiful place to live in. We have very low crime rates. We have low levels of addiction and chaotic lifestyle. There are all sorts of things about West Dorset which are exactly as you would want them to be. While in some parts of the country I think there are enormous social problems that need to be resolved, in the case of West Dorset, although there certainly are people that need help out of conditions that they're in, and as any MP would, I see them pretty regularly, and there's much to be done. But it's in particular, in general, West Dorset I think is in pretty good shape. My vision of it is that over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the advantages we have, the beauty, the serenity, the quality of life, will become more and more economically important. Because more and more as the great emerging countries of the East, China and India, come to dominate the world's economy, our place in Britain, and indeed in Europe in general and in the West in general, will be secured only if we're good at doing things with our brains and minds. We're not going to beat the competition on doing things which are mechanical. Machines and large numbers of people in the East will do those better than we can. It's using our brains that will, in a sort of knowledge economy, that's going to be the route to prosperity. And whereas when you're at a phase in your country's development where what matters is great smokestack industries and putting up great factories and so on, it's cities that have the advantage. When you move to a knowledge economy, the advantage lies in being in a place where people want to live. And so the quality of life becomes a huge economic advantage. And my vision is that by preserving the quality of life here, we can actually turn that to our economic advantage and continue to be prosperous, continue to have high levels of employment, offer people better jobs than they're currently able to get in many cases as they enter the workforce. And you begin to see that happening, actually. You can begin to see high-tech industries now locating in West Dorset in a most wonderful way, without, in many cases, most people even noticing, because they are not smokestack industries. They do not create great scars on the landscape, but they do provide good, high-paid, highly qualified jobs, and we need to make sure that we're training our young people to take those jobs, we're getting them into good universities so they can come back and do those jobs in a beautiful place, sustain the beautiful place. People will use brainpower to do high-value things economically at relatively lower rates of pay, and hence have a competitive advantage for employers if it's a nice place to be. You've got nice schools, you've got good public services, you've got a quality of life that is enviable. So I don't think we were talking earlier about things where I think you have to make a binary choice. I don't think here we do have to make a choice. We're very lucky. We don't have to choose between having a nice place to live in and having a prosperous place. We can have a prosperous place partly because it's a nice place to live in.
Yeah, I do think actually that one of the most positive things that's happened in our little area of our few parishes has been the extension of the superfast broadband scheme,
Yep.
the extra funding that came through, and to bring that as for many premises as fibre to the premises is an extraordinary infrastructure to have put in.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure that all of the people who live locally really at the moment appreciate how much of a benefit that's going to be in the future.
I think that's right, and I think, of course, as we move forward, what now seems a miraculous technology will seem ancient and creaky, and so we need to keep up with that.
Yeah.
But I think, yes, communications technologies are the infrastructure that rural areas most need, and which is least controversial, actually. I mean, putting a new road in, even putting a new railway in, certainly putting a new airport in, would cause very considerable problems where you would have to choose between environmental effects and economic effects. Broadband, you don't.
No. I'm very glad that you've mentioned new roads, because of course the next item on my list is the proposal, yet again, to have some kind of bypass for Chiddock. And we're in our parish away from Chiddock, nevertheless very interested in this, because there has been some suggestion that were that ever to happen, it would mean a road being built through perhaps some part of the Marshwood Vale.
Well, people in Chiddock voted to, by a majority of those who voted, to have a bypass as long as it didn't go through their parish. Now, this is fine, that's the democratic view, and we have to take it seriously, but obviously other adjoining parishes will also have their views about this, and I'm waiting for Chiddock Parish Council to come back to me at the moment with their plan about how they and I and county and district councillors can engage with the nearby parishes, because I represent the nearby parishes as much as I represent Chiddock, and I don't see how one can carry out that desire unless the nearby parishes want to do so. We'll see what happens.
Have you got future plans for things that you might be involved in locally once you stand down as an MP?
No, I haven't got any plans at all for 2022. 2022 is still quite a long way off. I find a difficult plan next week.
Okay, I think we'll finish there.